102 din po. All right, well, welcome to another episode of the Fatal Conceits podcast, dear listener. It's a show about money, markets, mobs, and manias, not necessarily and not always in that order. If you haven't already done so, please head over to our Substack page. You can catch us at bonnerprivateresearch.substack.com, and you'll be able to find there hundreds of articles from Bill Bonner and myself for free on everything from high finance to lowly politics. We've also got plenty of research reports from our investment director, Tom Dyson, and our macro man up in Laramie, Wyoming. That's Dan Denning. And of course, many more conversations just like this one under the Fatal Conceits podcast at the top of the page. I'm delighted to welcome today a recurring guest on this show. We're happy to have him. He is the investment director of Fortune and Freedom, which is part of South Bank Investment Research over in the UK. A good friend of mine and a fellow resident down here in Argentina, although we're talking to you from different locales in the city here today. It's Mr. Robert Marstrand. Welcome back to the show, Rob. How do you do?
Hi, Joel. Good to see you on this fine, sunny Buenos Aires day.
Yes. It is shaping up to be a lovely spring, isn't it? Good to be away from the Northern Hemisphere winter. Now, mate, I thought we'd get together for a bit of a powwow today because there's been just such a saturation of news coming out of your country of birth, the UK, particularly over the last few months, in which we've had 3 prime ministers in as many months. We've had a death of a monarch. We've had trouble in the bond markets. There's generational high inflation and economy in the tank, and plenty of, as I've noted in my recent weekend, as pink-haired morons disrupting civil society at museums and such on the weekend. There's lots to speak about here, and I think our American readers and our listeners, rather around the world, will be interested to get your take. So I thought maybe we could take it back to our last point of maybe familiarity for most listeners, where it all kind of went haywire, and that was back to the demise of Mr. Boris Johnson, affectionately known as Bojo around the world. For our listeners who are used to, at least in the United States, electing a president and having he or she go through their 4-year term, do you want to just maybe back up a little bit and start with the parliamentary processes over in the UK and how it can come to pass that we could have 3 different leaders within the same party in just as many months?
Yeah, sure thing, Joel. I mean, I have to say that Bojo is a lot snappier than his full name, which is Alexander Boris de Pfeffel Johnson. He's an old Etonian, which meant he went to Eton College, which is the posh school that royals and aristocracy like. And he is a political phenomenon because he's quite posh, but he seems to somehow cut through and gel with the sort of working class blue collar voter. So he's a phenomenon. We'll come back to him. Right. So how does it work? We have constituencies around the country. People elect an MP, a member of parliament, at each general election, which has to happen every 5 years or less. And basically the party that gets the most MPs into the House of Commons in parliament becomes the government, and their leader becomes the prime minister. At the same time, the head of state, which would be a president in most countries, the head of state is the Queen, or now the King Charles III. And that's like a figurehead. They're not meant to get into the dirty business of day-to-day politics. In fact, they're positively meant to keep their noses out of it. So the prime minister, the head of that party with the majority, is the person that basically runs the country through the parliamentary process. Now, what that means is that prime minister can be deposed by various methods. One is via a general election. So they might just get to the end of their term or run out of road, have to launch a general election, and they might lose power because their party gets thrown out. The second way is if there's enough rebellion in their party, there might be a vote of no confidence in the House of Commons, in Parliament. So all the opposition would vote against them, obviously, plus a few rebels. They get thrown out, and then you basically have a general election. And the third way, which is what we've been seeing recently, is that their own party can turn on them And in the Conservative Party, which we're talking about, which runs the country, the Tories, as they're also known, I believe they have to get something like 50 letters from members of Parliament of the party to something called the 1922 Committee. That launches a leadership process. So basically, the current leader can run, and anyone else can throw their hat in the ring. And whoever comes out on top after a number of stages ends up being the prime minister, because they end up running that, or being the head of that party. So as opposed to a directly elected president, the prime minister is the head of the most powerful party in the parliament, and that can be changed. So that's the main difference.
Right, kind of like the CEO of an organization. If they're not doing a good job and their underlings think maybe they need a change at the helm, they can appoint somebody new.
Yeah, it would be like if in the USA, I guess the nearest comparison would be, it would be like the country was run by whoever was head of the majority party in the House of Representatives. It's effectively that. And then you have the Senate as well. And in the UK, we have the House of Lords, which is an unelected body, which is another bizarre thing we could talk about another time.
Right. All right. So let's go back to Boris Johnson then, because I was in the UK, I think in July of this year, and there was already rumblings that some indiscretions of his had lost him the confidence of the party. There was uncoverings of hypocrisy, during the COVID lockdowns, where he was said to be having parties and such. It seemed like, people had essentially a gutful of top-down management of the pandemic by way of lockdowns, and people were none too happy about the kind of good for the, what's rules for thee, not for me kind of attitude that they perceived to be happening there. So he was deposed, which brings us to
hold on. It wasn't quite for that reason. So that was called Partygate or Cakegate. Everything's a something gate. What it was a series of parties or social gatherings by him and all the people very closely around him in number 10 Downing Street, who were in breach of the rules that they'd imposed on everyone else about not having social gatherings during COVID. Now, the actual breach itself was quite minor in a way. It's a few people sitting around eating pizza or cake or having a beer in the garden or whatever. The point was people were furious because they'd imposed these rules on everyone else. You couldn't visit your aging parents in a care home, and you couldn't get your friends around. And so that was the point. But that wasn't what actually finished him. It nearly did. He has a habit of being a little bit economical with the actualité. He's a bit economical with the truth, shall we say. And often gets caught out. What actually finished him was there was a scandal with an MP who has a rather appropriate name. His name is Chris Pincher, and they say Pincher by name, Pincher by nature. And it turns out he'd had a reputation for being a bit frisky with other men when he'd had a few too many drinks. And he was accused of having sexually assaulted two other MPs, I believe. And Boris Johnson had sort of claimed that he didn't know about it. And that was the final straw, that it was the claims about not knowing about things or not being involved, them being discovered, and that was the final straw, and they decided to kick him out.
Okay. So between the pinchers and the parties, Boris was shown the door. This all gets a little kind of Game of Thrones from here with some coup d'etats and et tu brute. But so then we have Liz Truss is the sort of billed as the kind of Maggie Thatcher Iron Lady version 2.0. She comes along with her new Chancellor of the Exchequer, her mini budget, tax cuts. She's supposed to rein in the economy. She's supposed to get tamp down on inflation, which is running, I think it was 13+% presently. So it's still as high or higher than it is in many other Western countries at the moment. But bring us up to speed with what happened with the very short-lived Truss government. I think 55 days or something in the end.
Yeah. So Johnson resigned in July. There was an election process within the Conservative Party, which they narrowed down the candidates to two. the Conservative Party members, who are people that sort of pay, dues to the party. About 140,000 people voted, chose Liz Truss over Rishi Sunak, who we'll come on to. And she got into power. In the middle of this, literally, she went to see the Queen to officially take the role in September. And the Queen passed away, I think, 2 days later, which was obviously a massive period of mourning for the country. And the Queen's been on the throne for 70 years.
Mm.
Then there was the period of, the long queue around London to go and see the Queen's coffin and the funeral service. And then sort of very shortly after that, champing at the bit, the Truss government and her Chancellor, who's like the Treasury Secretary, launched this mini budget, which was all about tax cuts and energy subsidies, and promised structural reforms to get rid of EU law after Brexit, and very non-specific sort of statements about cutting public spending. It was at the same moment that the markets were already throwing a wobbly. Dollar was going through a spike. A lot of currencies falling against the dollar, a lot of bond markets dropping as yields rose in this inflationary rising interest rate environment. But they got all the blame. I mean, part of it was their fault. Frankly, the communication was bad. They did it too fast. It was rushed. They should have tried to build a bit more consensus. And in that market turmoil, pension funds melting down, Bank of England having to step in. We can talk about the pension funds. It's a technical thing, but basically the party turned on her, and so she got to a position where she suddenly had to backtrack on all these policies rapidly, really rapid backpedaling. She kicked out senior people who'd only just been appointed, like the Chancellor, the Finance Minister, effectively, and then she was gone. And I think she resigned on day 45, and she was actually out of the role on day 49, something like that. She's the shortest serving Prime Minister in British history.
Yeah, it's quite extraordinary, isn't it, to have such a almost turnstile style leadership in a we're not talking about some banana republic here, which we might expect something like this to happen down in our neck of the woods here in South America, but this is a G7 country. People are supposed to be sensible and have a stiff upper lip and whatnot, and as you say, markets throwing wobblies and all kinds of things. I want to go back to that, to the bond market for a second, and the issue with the UK gilts, because it was quite extraordinary to watch in such a short period of time. Just what was going on with the pound sterling, what was happening with yields. I just want to read a quick quote from the Bank of England, which eventually stepped in with both halting its bond selling program and announcing that it was going to buy up to 65 billion pounds worth of bonds. Here's the quote here. It says, "Were dysfunction in this market to continue or worsen, there would be a material risk to UK financial stability." It's quite an extraordinary statement. It goes on to say, "This would lead to an unwarranted tightening of financial conditions and a reduction of the flow of credit to the real economy," which I guess was part of the problem in the first place. But do you want to maybe unpack what was happening across the pond during that sort of 10-day period? Because, I remember first going over to the UK 20 plus years ago and being very disappointed when my meager Aussie dollar savings was slashed by 2/3. The pound was king or queen at the time. And we very nearly approached, I think, pound US dollar parity, which is something I haven't seen in my lifetime. And yeah, just walk us through what was happening at that particular moment. You mentioned pension funds, of course, being at the core of it.
Yeah, well, the root of this, of course, is that during COVID, all the big Western central banks printed huge amounts of money in the process called QE to basically fund the government handouts, as far as I'm concerned. And they don't obviously present it that way, but they were printing money so that governments could borrow more money and spend it on, the stimmy checks, or in the UK, furlough payments, as they were called. Bank of England's been very slow to respond to the inflation that's caused. In fact, they didn't even realize it was coming. I mean, clearly all the Fed, Bank of England, European Central Bank, plus others, all made the same mistake, didn't think this would create inflation, and it has. don't blame it all on Putin. Trust me, it's not all his fault. It's the central
Right.
banks. The day before the mini budget that Truss's government launched, the tax cutting, or actually cancelling tax rises, most of it, budget, the Bank of England had raised interest rates, but by less than the market expected. And they're way behind the curve compared to the Federal Reserve in terms of getting a grip on inflation. Inflation's already over 10% a year and still rising in the UK. And they announced the first stage of quantitative tightening. So that's selling gilts, UK government bonds, into the market to drain liquidity. So they were both, tightening policy in one way, but not tightening it enough in another way. So they weren't raising interest rates enough. Then you got this, the market throws a wobbly, and they have to completely backtrack and reverse and say, oh, well, actually, no, we're not selling gilts this week anymore. We're going to buy them instead. I think it was 2 weeks, actually. Now, what's interesting is the pension funds you mentioned. So these are the corporate pension funds that the money is sort of managed on behalf of a company or a public sector body to provide pensions for people in the future. It's not the sort of pensions where you put your own money into your own fund and then invest it. It's those corporate funds. Now, it turned out, who knew? Turned out they've been playing fast and loose in the derivatives markets. These supposedly safe, stable, heavily regulated, boring pension funds have been taking on leverage in the derivative markets through something called liability derived investment or something like that. It's LDI anyway. I can't remember the acronym. So many. And this leverage, when the bond market crashed or moved quite quickly, meant they had to stump up tons of extra cash to cover their margin calls, their sort of collateral, if you like, with the people they were trading with. And they couldn't liquidate fast enough, which was going to create a snowball effect in the bond market and make things worse. So the bank stepped in to stabilize the bond market. But the interesting thing is, it subsequently came to light that the Bank of England itself had 82% of its own employee pension fund in one of these leverage schemes that, in my opinion, shouldn't have been going on in the first place. So there was also a massive conflict of interest at the Bank of England. And obviously, it would have been terribly embarrassing if their pension fund got into big trouble. So there's a lot of sort of layers and layers to this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. It is, again, I keep using the word extraordinary. I'm cognizant of this, but they really are remarkable times when when, as you say, you might well have the majority of pensions for workers at the Bank of England at risk of.
I mean, look, you seriously couldn't make this stuff up. I mean, it's just, it really is Banana Republic stuff, frankly. It's embarrassing, and they just need to get a grip.
All right, so let's fast forward a little bit, because we're going to come back and touch on a few of these points in our wrap up in a moment. But it was the present Prime Minister, who we're about to get to, who I believe was Chancellor of the Exchequer during the time when the government was printing money to extend these furlough payments. He was, I think, this is Rishi Sunak, who was. He was the Chancellor of the Exchequer. I just checked on this morning, but it was February of 2022. So this is right as the pandemic was really kind of kicking off in the Western world. He took over from Sajid Javid, who served until February of that year. Sorry, I meant to say February 2020. And Rishi was in that role from February 2020 to July of this year. So it was Rishi who really oversaw that massive spending program. And as they say, no bad deed goes unrewarded in the realm of politics. So after having spent all this money, which the government was printing to have to cover, he's now been awarded the top job. So let's go to our third Prime Minister in as many months. And we can start from the demise of Truss and the rise of Sunak.
Well, of course, Sunak was extremely popular at first when he was Chancellor, because he was handing out tons of money to people.
Funny that.
Funny how people like free money, but they don't think about what comes next. So he actually resigned just before Boris Johnson resigned from his So he stuck the knife into Johnson, clearly with an eye on getting the top job. Then things didn't go to plan for the sort of establishment, and Truss got the job. Then she got effectively kicked out, resigned technically, but effectively got kicked out. She had no authority.
Yep.
He put his hat in the ring again to run for Prime Minister. Boris Johnson came back and was running. So he reappeared, and he had to hustle himself onto a plane. He was on holiday in Barbados or somewhere, and rushed back over the weekend to get back in to garner enough support from MPs to go forward. And there was a third candidate who is not worth talking about. And then Johnson just suddenly dropped out, having claimed he had enough support, dropped out. And so Sunak effectively was anointed the head of the Conservative Party without it going to any kind of vote of even the members of the Conservative Party, the grassroots activists and members. So it's a lot of people see it as a kind of globalist coup, if you like, because he's always been a bit more of that kind of globalist, high tax, big state. He's ex-Goldman Sachs, the whole, so financial establishment. So a lot of people are very upset about it, who feel that it's happened in an undemocratic way, both within the Conservative Party and clearly outside the Conservative Party. But just to clarify, Joel, I think you must have got his name wrong, because President Biden said that he's called Rishi Sunak, not Rishi Sunak. So Biden obviously gets everything right. So we'll have to change his name.
Yeah, he would know. I can't remember the last time Biden made a gaffe. So let's just go with Sunak from now on. Then, shall we? Rishi Sunak. So this brings us essentially to present day. We have a World Economic Forum rising star in. Now I'm going to keep pronouncing his name incorrectly. I'm going to get confused. Sunak. Rishi Sunak. So we have an ex-Goldman establishment fellow. So Rishi is a man who was very much in favor of a second referendum for Brexit when the establishment didn't get the vote that it wanted after the first vote. He was a proponent for going back to the polls and asking the Brits again, are you really sure this is what you want? And giving them
keep asking until you get the answer that you want. That's the way it works. Yes, that's sort of standard EU modus operandi. Is to they did it. They've done it many times.
It's a kind of democracy by attrition. We just wear you down. We just keep asking you until we get the answer we want. But there are a few other things, and you've touched on a couple of them, that give a little bit of insight into the way that Rishi Sunak may be sort of pointed and may govern. I just want to touch on a couple of them. He's already announced, and it's widely expected in his policy agenda, which comes out later in November, that he's going to be raising the corporations tax from 19 to 25%. This is in fairly stark contrast to the Truss administration recently ousted. And I noticed in his very first Prime Minister questions time, he reinstated the 2019 moratorium on drilling for shale gas in the UK. So just to sort of bring listeners up to date, this was a moratorium that was overturned by the Truss government, who recognized that, of course, the UK is facing somewhat of an energy crisis, as is large swaths of Europe right now as we head into winter, something we at Bonner Private Research have long been calling the coming winter catastrophe. It's almost on our doorstep now. And yeah, one of the very first things that Mr. Sunak has said is that he will reinstate that moratorium. So we're going to be having higher taxes. We're going to be having a man who makes no secret about wanting to remain aligned with the European Union and Brussels, and somebody who is apparently not at all worried about the energy security of the UK, at least not enough to drill for shale gas in his country. So what can we expect going forward now, assuming that he lasts longer than his predecessor?
Well, I think what we can expect is a very big recession, because they're raising taxes into an environment where interest rates are rocketing. So unlike the US, people don't have the good fortune to be able to get 30-year fixed rate mortgages. So most people have a variable rate mortgage or a maximum 2, maybe 5 in a few cases, fixed rate. And as those roll off, people are starting to find their mortgage interest goes through the roof, which obviously squeezes people's earnings. On the natural gas point, natural gas is tremendously important in the UK, both for power production, so electricity, because when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, that's the sort of base power, because no one's been very keen on nuclear for a long time.
Are you suggesting that the sun doesn't shine in the UK? I thought you got at least a week of sunshine in the UK.
Yeah, exactly. I can't remember where, but somewhere. but yeah, I mean,
it's scattered.
It's layers upon layers again, because you couldn't make this up. So they banned fracking, made gas their most important fuel source. And by the way, lots of houses in the UK use it for domestic heating, water heating, and cooking as well. So it's very important.
Yep.
And the Conservative Party, I don't remember which year, actually decommissioned the only major natural gas storage unit in the UK as well. So they haven't even got like a reserve of the stuff. So with the obvious sanctions against Russia for following the invasion of Ukraine and cutting off of that, which was the main supply of gas into Europe, the prices have rocketed. Now, the UK actually doesn't buy much gas from Russia, never did. It buys most of it from Norway, such that it doesn't produce at home. But of course, the price has still gone up in Norway, just like everywhere else. So it's created a big problem. So the Truss government thought they'd explore fracking. There are big reserves both in the north and the south of England. But now they've gone back to the net zero agenda and preventing that moving forward. So it seems like a situation where there will be energy insecurity, relatively speaking. Of course, by the way, this is, I think, relevant to the US. The US clearly sees this as an opportunity. I mean, I think there have been statements by various US politicians to replace the gas demands in Europe, including the UK, with liquid natural gas that comes over from the USA. So it's put in ships, turned into liquid, put in ships, sailed over, turned back into gas. Now that's a lot more expensive than gas pipelines. But what it also means is, at the margin, well, I've talked to American oil and gas executives about this, at the margin, it's driving up the price of natural gas in the USA. So there's a knock-on effect to US energy prices and inflation. And the question is how long US politicians will actually put up with that. And if they start reintroducing export controls on US gas to keep the price down there in a tricky inflationary political environment, Europe's left hanging, basically. So it'd be interesting to see how it pans out. But back to the UK, look, basically, it's going to be a big recession. I read something this morning. One of the major lending banks, probably the biggest mortgage bank in the country, saying that house prices could fall as much as 20% next year, in 1 year. So
in a year alone.
And that's their worst case scenario. But it's going to get hard. It's going to mean people are very upset with the politicians. It increases the likelihood of a Labour government next, and no one even knows their policies. They haven't got. I've checked their website. There are virtually no policies on there. But I think they're very left wing, and I think we could see again even higher taxes. Oh, and I should add this: the tax ratio to GDP in the UK currently, under a supposedly conservative, supposedly pro-business, supposedly pro-market government, is the highest it's been since the 1950s. I think it's running at well, I forget the number now, but it's running at something like 70% of GDP, some crazy number anyway. But the highest since the 1950s, highest in 7 decades. So that shows you the pickle the place is in, the problem they have. So I think it's going to get worse before it gets better. That's all I can say.
Right. That's what passes for fiscal restraint and conservatism these days is really a far cry from what we might have expected, what our fathers and grandfathers might have expected. And as you say, echoes of of similar problems really around the Western world right now. And I guess that's to be expected when you take off for various reasons, whether you on whatever side of the fence you fall. When you take off the market, one of the largest gas and oil exporters in the world, then you're going to have a scramble for supplies, and that's not at all helpful during and in the UK, in the US as well, and elsewhere. The kind of inflation that we haven't seen since going back to the 70s. I think the UK's inflation rate is, I think, north of 13% now, if I read that correctly, just in the past couple of days, which is
yeah, what the traditional measure called retail prices index is around that level. Yeah, but of course they're
always statistics
standardizing to the international norm of the consumer prices index, which conveniently is about 3% lower.
Sure. Okay. Well, in any case, I don't think these numbers, you can tell the average consumer who's struggling to make ends meet and is having to choose between milk and eggs, which people are smashing and pouring all over the floor in protest that we didn't even get to, choosing between those sort of staple goods and whether or not to heat their house. It's not going to matter much different if politicians tell them that it's 11.6% or 12.9%. They know, they feel the pain, and from what you say, there's apparently more of it to come. So with all that gloomy backdrop, I think we've been able to sift through much of the Shakespearean comedy / tragedy, depending on how you wish to view it this fine morning. Rob, what are you doing with regards to your investment advice for your many tens of thousands of readers I know that you have with Fortune and Freedom over in the UK? And are there any opportunities that you think might be more broadly shared with a larger audience?
Yeah, I mean, I by the way, I'd just correct one thing. I do work with Fortune and Freedom, but the actual publication I do myself is UK Independent Wealth. It's very UK focused, but
I'll put a link to those beneath so that our listeners can check out your work.
Perfect. Look, I warned people to avoid the bond markets nearly 2 years ago, and that's been absolutely the right call. Bond markets have crashed. I currently think the US stock market is still very overvalued. It peaked on the 3rd of January this year. It's down about a quarter, maybe 20% now. That's only 10 months. In the past, when we've had such big bubbles, by the way, on some measures, the bubble in the US stock market was the second biggest after the technology bubble of 99-2000. And currently, it's only been matched by the bubble of 1929, followed by the Wall Street crash. So it's still a very expensive market. So I'm generally avoiding that. The things I like, cash is bad, obviously, because it's losing value against inflation, and interest rates on bank deposits are still rubbish. So the things I'm focusing on are gold, which has languished a bit this year, particularly dollars, because the dollar is so strong. But I don't think we're out of this inflation problem yet. And gold will have its day, in my opinion. It's just there's a bit of a time lag for it to take off. And I'm looking for very cheap, high dividend yield, solid companies with no debts, ideally, to ride out this storm for a few years, generate an income and not go bust in the process, because I think a lot of companies are going to go bust as interest rates rise. Yeah.
What's that Buffett saying about seeing who is swimming without shorts when the tide goes out? I think we're going to see a few naked bums in the next couple of years. All right, Rob, mate, thank you very much for getting us up to speed with the various goings on across the pond. To our listeners out there in the US, the UK, and all around the world, thanks for tuning in again. We'll be back again next week with another Fatal Conceits podcast. In the meantime, again, please head over to the Substack page. You can find us at bonnerprivateresearch.substack.com. Plenty of good stuff over there, including more conversations like this. I'll leave you today and catch up with you again next week. Rob, thanks a lot for joining us, mate. Catch you again soon.